Good morning. I'm just going to continue my series on the 2013 World Championship match between the defending champion Vishwanathan Anand Vishy and Magnus Carlsen. Carlsen leads 1-0 after the fifth game, and we're now in the sixth game. And this proves to be one of the most characteristic games Carlsen played. Not just in the match, but ever. This is Carlsen doing Carlsen things that is Carlsen best. So e4, Anand has white, Carlsen has black. e4, e5, knight comes to f3, knight comes to c6. We've seen this before in World Championship matches, right from the very first World Championship match. And Anand plays bishop to b5, threatening the right knight. Doesn't really threaten to win the pawn immediately because of the defense of coming to d4 with the queen after the pawn is taken. So that was a knight, bishop takes pawn, knight takes bishop, knight takes pawn, then queen comes to d5, d4, threatens the knight, threatens the pawn, can't defend both, gets the pawn back. Better position for black. So it isn't a real threat to win the pawn yet. f6, the Berlin defense, which is a real threat to win a pawn. The pawn on e4. So d3 defends the pawn. This was used by Carlsen in the next match, which we've already seen, doing things in the wrong order, of course. And so the bishop now comes to c5. His development is near to being complete and he's ready to castle. c3, both to strengthen his grip on d4 to make the possibility of playing d4 at some point in the future nearer, and to guarantee keeping a square for the light coloured bishop so they can have that bishop later in the game when he might need it. Both sides castle, and the rook comes to e8. So now there is a real threat to take this pawn and take the pawn here. So he defends the pawn with the rook. So rook comes to e8, which creates the threat of taking the pawn. When the pawn takes, coming here with the knight, with the pawn, and then swapping everything off and being left with a pawn here on the e file. But Carlsen is willing to take that risk, and asks the bishop, does he really want to take that knight, or is he just pretending? Vishy says, just let me think about it for a minute, and Carlsen says, no, you've not got a minute to think about it. Your time was up. A good move by Vishy, bishop to b3, because most of us might just go automatically to c2, which for the first thing takes a square away from the queen, and for the second doesn't put pressure on here. So what Vishy's saying is, yeah, if you want to attack this bishop again, then you're going to have to put your knight on a stupid square. So, and now this pawn is probably in some danger, so Carlsen defends it with the d6 pawn. Bishop comes to g5, and the bishop comes to e6. Yeah, if he swaps off, the pawn takes, and Carlsen would have good pressure against the d5 square and the possibility of, in the not too distant future, playing the move d5 himself. Knight comes to d2, and he asks the bishop the question, are you going to take that knight, or are you just pretending? Anand says, let me think about it for a minute. Carlsen says, sure, think about it whilst I do something else, and he takes the bishop. Yeah, this is one way. This pin here, pin of this knight to the queen, can be very difficult to break. This is a complicated way of doing it, but it works. So he takes the pawn, and the knight reroutes, and it's going to come to the square b7. Sorry, d7 to defend the knight. Then the queen's going to come to e7, and then the queen's going to come to e6, so that it's no longer pinned. And for that to work, he had to get rid of the bishop on b3. That's how this works. So comes to h3, prevent the use of the of this square by the eventually unpinned knight, and also gives an escape square to his king, Luft, as we say. Knight comes to d7 as advertised for, and the knight takes advantage of this square, h2, and is now threatening to come to g4, whilst the queen is still pinned, and then maybe it can swap and swap and swap. You know, maybe it can damage the pawn structure. But the queen comes to e7, and the other knight comes to f1. Seems a bit crazy to have these knights in this arrangement, but of course they're both going to other places. To here, and yeah, we'll see. Bishop comes to b6, so that when the move d4 comes, it isn't a threat on the bishop, and so that now he is in a position to play c5 and put a clamp on the d4 square. The knight comes to e3. Yeah, this is a good square. It allows the possibility of playing this. Queen comes to e6, as advertised. He's now free of that pin. And the pawn comes to b5, b4, because when the queen came here, it threatened the pawn on c3, b3, and then the queen would be tied to defending that pawn, and he didn't want that, so he moved it. So the pawn comes to a5, and Carlsen is threatening to break open the take the pawn and ruin Annand's structure. Anand can't allow that, so he takes with the pawn, and the bishop takes. Taken with the rook would make it difficult for him to retain control of the a file. So the knight comes to g4, and the bishop goes to b6. And at this moment in time, whoever swaps off the rooks ends up worse off, because the other person, whilst the queen is here, so that the queen can't come to so the rook can't come to a1, whoever swaps off here is worse. So if Annand takes, then Carlsen takes back with the rook and has possession of the a file. If Carlsen takes, Annand takes with the queen, and then can play queen here, you know, and begin to pressure the centre. So the bishop goes back to b6, and Annand swaps off. And now he might be in a position to end up in an endgame where it's queen and knight against queen and bishop. And as we know from before, because I've talked about it many times, queen and knight is thought to be better by a small amount than queen and bishop. Why? Because a queen and knight can cooperate better than a queen and bishop. Knight can cover all coloured squares, bishop only one coloured square. And a queen and knight just go very well together as well. So he gets rid of that knight, and we do indeed have queen and knight against queen and bishop situation. Yeah, there are two pairs of rooks, so you know we're not quite in that position. Because whilst there's still rooks on the board, that advantage isn't as big as it would be. But the knight comes to the queen comes to g4, so that he's now threatening to play knight here, a great square for the knight, and then he's threatening to threatening this pawn. So you know it's a much too dangerous position for Carlsen. So he takes the knight off. He's not accepting. He takes it off now whilst the queen's moved, because now he can't take with the rook, otherwise he loses the rook. You might think he can take with the rook, but he can't take with the rook because Carlsen takes here with the queen and says check, and then takes the rook. So he has to take the knight, the bishop, and now he's got double pawns. So Carlsen has a tiny little advantage in this endgame because he doesn't have double pawns, and Annand does. And here, Carlsen, from here onwards, there's another 30 or 40 moves in this game. From here onwards, Carlsen works on that's tiny advantage, and squeezes blood out of a stone, because I think if we look at the analysis, minus 0.33 to Carlsen, so he's a third of a pawn better. A third of a pawn better at this time was a winning endgame advantage to Carlsen. And yeah, he just does this masterfully, manoeuvring to get all these pieces in their best possible places before doing anything. So the queen comes to e7. Why? Because this frees up this pawn here. So the rook comes to f1 to make this move more difficult. And the pawn comes to c5 to strengthen the grip on d4. d4 won't be happening now, because apart from anything, this pawn would be lost at the end of the series of exchanges. So king comes to h2 and he comes to c4. Doesn't this give Annand the opportunity to straighten out his pawns? No, it doesn't. Think, yeah, maybe he can play e5. No. D5, d4, yeah, he can play d4 now. But no, he takes with the rook to distract the rook. And no, he could take with the pawn now. And he can't really take with this pawn, or the pawn on e4 would fall, attacked by the queen and rook. But instead he puts his queen in a slightly better position on b7, where it's still attacking that pawn, still got the same threat, but it's a slightly better square because it allows the rook to enjoy the benefits of the e file. So the rook comes to d1 and the queen comes to c6. Again, a slight improvement, still putting pressure on here, but taking some control over the sixth line. Annand puts his queen in a better position. And now he takes. And he can't take with the e-pawn because queen takes d4. e4 still wins a pawn. So he takes with the rook to support it, but now he's got permanently doubled pawns in the middle. Doubled and isolated e-pawns. And the rook comes to e5, of course, a much more active square. And Annand's got to look after the e5, e4 pawn. So he's only really got two choices: queen e5 or queen f3. G5, sorry, or f3. f3 is probably a more active square. The queen comes to c6. Stopping getting this, but then he's threatening to double up on here. Yeah, it's just, it's a better position for the queen. Oh, the idea is that, if we go back, the idea is that if he plays the pawn here, and he takes with the pawn, then rook takes pawn as a pin, as a check. And yeah, that's the idea. So the king comes out of the way of that, and the queen comes to e7, returning to a position where the rook and the queen are now both fixed, trying to defend the e4 pawn. So the queen comes to g4, another square where it can defend, and the king comes to h7 to make the possibility of playing g6 and f5 more realistic. And the queen comes to f4 and the pawn comes to g6. And no, it's got a realistic possibility of playing f5. Doesn't that let the pawns undouble? Yeah, it does, but it comes at a cost, because then Carlsen would play rook takes and take possession of that then completely open file with his rook. And the king comes forward, and the king comes to g2, g7 to be a bit nearer to being in a position to defend these pawns. Queen comes to f3, the rook comes to e6. Yeah, now he's threatening to come here with the rook, or here with the queen. Force off some swaps. The queen gets out of the way of that, but the cost of getting out of the way of that is that this pawn is now open to being taken. If he takes with the rook, then Carlsen can take with the rook, Annand can take this pawn, Carlsen can take this pawn. He ends up still a pawn up. but he takes with the queen rather, which is a better move. Because if it's a better move. It allows his rook to be in a more active position. So the doubled pawns are eliminated, but Carlsen's a pawn up in this endgame. And now the queen's come off, and the bishop gets to an active square. Isn't it the case that now Carlsen's rook has to go passive on b7, and it's Annand who's got the active rook? Yes, it is. But Carlsen is in a position to bring his king to bear, and then begin to put pressure on this rook, and then expand with these pawns on the other side. So Carlsen has to defend the pawn for now, and Annand comes to d6. This is a better square for the rook, but the pawn comes forward. Now he's threatening, for example, to come here and here and chase the rook off the 6th file, or it can go here, but that's not a particularly good square. And then Carlsen could probably play g4, g5, and then get the king out via g6. So Annand plays h4, which is a good move, and Carlsen goes on with his plan of playing f7. And now we see the reason why it's a good move. It's because of this pawn sacrifice. If he doesn't take the pawn, Annand takes it anyway, and he's achieved the same thing. And what he's achieved is he's broken up these pawns. So instead of being 3 pawns against 2 straight up on the queen side, he's still down a pawn on the queen side. He goes in fact down 2 pawns because Carlsen takes it. But look at these pawns now, isolated and doubled, much weaker, able to be attacked. This is Annand's point, and he attacks one straight away. And the king has to come to g6 to defend that pawn. But the king comes to g3, and he's heading to h4, where he will be attacking the pawn another time. So he's threatening to get his pawn back. He's still going to be a pawn down because he's 2 pawns down at the minute, but yeah, this is a definite improvement for Annand, a much more defendable endgame. Rook to b6, and he comes here to give his rook more possibilities before playing king to h4. But Carlsen cuts the rook off from that move anyway. But now the king comes in to threaten the pawn, and still he's threatening this pawn. Carlsen abandons that pawn. He's got other plans. So he wins the pawn, but he gets e4 check, and now the king manages to come to g5. The rook comes to b8, threatening to check the king. Pawn comes to h4, still defended by the king and the rook, but he says check. And now you think, yeah, but if he plays his king in the corner, it's never getting out of there, because the rook can just keep the g file. But Carlsen finds a way out of that little trap that he puts himself in, because he's Carlsen. So the rook threatens the f pawn, and now the idea is that if the knight comes to defend it, the rook says check again, and a little back and forwards dance, repetition method of finding a draw to defend the position. But Carlsen defends the pawn with the rook, and now he might just about think about playing rook to f2 and attacking the b2 pawn. So he attacks the c8 pawn to keep the rook pinned bound to defend the pawn. Rook comes to g4. It's a more active square where he also defends the pawn. And he comes to f8 again. Now he can threaten this pawn. And Carlsen checks, and then comes with his king. And no worries if Annand says check. then Carlsen comes here. And if he takes the pawn. He's got 3 against 2. And notice that this one pawn stops this pawn from moving. So 1 pawn is as good as 2 at the moment on this side. And so he does say the check, and the king does come to f4. And of course he can't afford to take it. But no, the c pawn drops. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Annand's got 2 passed pawns. What is Carlsen playing at? And also, it's 3 pawns against 3, so he's just sacrificed a pawn for nothing. Or so it would seem. But it's not for nothing. No, this pawn can't be attacked by the king. So, you know, he is a step nearer to playing pawn to f3. And then he's just a step away from being a queen. So Annand goes to a4 to be out of the way of the c pawn, so that he's threatening to just go ahead and get a new queen. And Carlsen plays h3. Can't Annand just take it? Yeah, but if he just takes it, the pawn comes. If he just takes it, then the rook just retreats, and then the pawn is free to march in, and the king on e3 holds the rook off the f file. But he takes it anyway, and Carlsen retreats the rook, and now the f pawn is free to become a queen, and it's Annand's king who's trapped by the rook on the g file. Fantastic. Just, looks like some kind of sorcery. So the pawn goes forward, and the pawn goes forward. But Carlsen's pawn is considerably nearer to being a queen than is Annand's. He plays check, and the king comes to e2. Now, all the squares that the king needs to promote are defended. But he plays b4, not just to support the pawn, but so that he can play a2 check, making it more difficult to promote to a queen. Carlsen pushes the pawn anyway, and then he comes to f3, still defending the pawn and still keeping the rook out of the king out of the game. And now he's threatening to play rook f1 check. So he checks with the king, and the king comes to f4, where it can't be checked by the rook, and still he's threatening to play f1 queen. So he comes up with a new trick, that if he gets a queen on f1, then the rook comes here check, wins the queen, and then suddenly he's got 3 pawns against 1, and 2 of them have passed on this side. Carlsen comes to g1, so that he's threatening to play pawn here check, and then that idea doesn't, queen here, pawn here, queen, that idea doesn't work, because the queen would then be defended by this rook. And then there's nothing to do. And if he comes here, and Carlsen comes here, he takes the pawn, Carlsen takes the pawn, and this rook is in an ideal position to stop these 2 pawns. They're not on the 6 yet, and he can get the rook behind them, where it stops them moving forward, and he can clean them up, and then he's still got a rook against these pawns. Nothing for Annand to do, and so he gave up. And so, with a brilliant endgame grind, Carlsen takes a 2-0 lead in the match. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.